Good afternoon. My name is Colonel Pat Baker, and I am the Installation Support Panel Chair. And today I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking with you, give you an ISP update, and talk a little bit about the POM process in the context of the FY15 President's Budget and how it was built and how we defend it. And we'll move on to the FY16 POM that we're all deep inside of right now. And we'll touch a little bit about FY17. Next slide, please. So as we talk through these things on the agenda, what I'm going to do is give you on the 15 President's Budget. That's already at the Hill, as you all know, and it's certainly gone to committee and to conference and all those types of issues. But I want to touch on how we build it and what guides the development of the President's Budget. We'll talk about the tough choices that are inside the Installation Support Panel portfolio, and in particular how you all will see those at the installation level. I'm going to touch on a couple of technical things relative to how the budget is organized. And so I'll use the short phrases of red and orange money, and we'll touch on that in a minute so that it makes sense on what we're talking about. And then we'll do basically a step-by-step review of all of the major programs that are comprised in the Installation Support Panel from a civil engineer functional perspective, and let you understand where we're sitting with the FY15 budget that, again, is on the Hill. From there, we'll transition into the FY16 POM. We'll talk about how the POM was built. What are the rules of engagement that allowed us to build that POM? The process that we go through. And I want to spend a little bit of time here so that you understand how your installation level requirements roll up to MAGCOM level requirements and get eventually integrated into the overall process. So I want to spend some time on that. And then we'll touch on timeline and the pace of change and how all that works. And then finally, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about the 17 planning cycle. And really what I want to talk about here is how the process is changing and how you at the installation will see change. Certainly, as we all know, the Air Force Installation and Mission Support Center provisional is approved and is activated. And so we will see some change happen over the next several years in how this works, or who does what to whom, may be more accurate. But we will talk about the 17 planning cycle and how that influences POM as we go through this. So to start with, I want you to have a basic understanding of how this gets done and what the Air Force corporate structure looks like when we say that. So the Air Force goes through what we would call a corporate process to build its budget and its POM, its Program Objective Memorandum. What that looks like in the physical sense is what you see here. And I'll caveat this to say one of the things I'd like you to notice is take a mental picture of this slide and this organization, and then we'll be prepared to talk about the differences in this when we get to the FY17 planning, because it's a little bit different in how we built this. And to be honest, there's some differences in 16 as well. But the way the Air Force works is it has a corporate process where we have an Air Force Council, which is the chief, the secretary, all of the MAGCOM commanders, so that 4-star level leadership event. Below that, we have a 2-star level vetting process called the Air Force Board. The Air Force Board is comprised of, normally it's the A58s from the major commands. The A58 here at the Air Staff is the chair of that body. The panels all support it. There are MAGCOM representatives, half functional representatives, but that basically is an advisory board. And that's where, to be honest, a lot of the deep analysis is happening before something goes forward to the chief and the secretary and the 4-stars to make a recommendation on what we ought to be doing. Below that is what's called used to be called the Air Force Group. So this is a characteristic slide from 15. So we used to call it the Air Force Group. Now we call it the Intermediate Level Review, the ILR. It's chaired by the Deputy A58X, so that's a 1-star general. It's comprised of the 06 kind of programmers at each of the major commands and some 06 functional representatives from across the headquarters staff. Below that, you have mission panels, mission support panels, and on the side here, at certain times of the year, we have these issue teams. So this process is used for POM, but it's also used for other regular business that happens. So an example I would give you is the basing process. The basing process has a strategic basing review, an executive steering group, and all of those functions. Those then will sometimes feed into the Air Force Board for review before something goes forward on into the chief and the secretary for a decision. So this corporate structure, we use it for the budget and for the POM, but we use it for other things as well. The part that we're going to talk about really is the panel part and how that feeds into this structure. And so you see on that mission support panel side, you'll see Agile Combat Support Logistics, Agile Combat Support RDT&E, Agile Combat Support Installations, and Agile Combat Support Education and Training. And so what we would take from that is, if you look at your Air Force is organized into core function leads. It's broken up into major kind of focus areas, and you'll see those represented in these panels. So the mission support panels are kind of the 4 primary subdivisions of the Agile Combat Support core function lead. On the other side, in those mission panels, you see NDO, Nuclear Deterrence Ops. So the Nuclear Deterrence Ops core function lead is the Air Force Global Strike Commander. But they're not always one and the same, right? So you look at, on the left-hand side, they're Global Integrated ISR, Command and Control, Air Superiority, Global Precision Attack. So those are 4 core functions that all reside inside Air Combat Command. And so sometimes the MAJCOMs have a dual-hatted role where they are the core function lead, and sometimes you have MAJCOMs that are not a core function lead, like Pacific Air Forces or USAFE. So it's the distinction I will draw this to is that the POM information, budget information, is handled in the core function lead chain. And these chains, as they're described in the panel descriptions, is pretty much how it's built. So the inputs will come up through these panels and get into that process. And that's what we're going to spend some time talking about as we go through. So I'm going to move on to slide 4 and just kind of touch on the timeline. And what I will tell you up front is, again, this is the POM 15 timeline. So, and the process that we used for 16 and the process that we will use for 17 had different timing here. And so again, I put this slide in here for you to understand and to begin to appreciate the changes that are happening in the process. So don't get hung up on the old acronyms. That's not the intent. The intent is for you to understand that this is a pretty lengthy process. And what I would draw your attention to is, so you see at the kind of the January time frame. So when we're talking POM 15, when are we actually physically talking about? We're talking about calendar year 13, right? So in the January of 13 time frame, we are building that POM so that by the time we get all the way through that cycle, we're ready to submit the president's budget in that next spring cycle. So in this case, the kind of initial action at the headquarters level starts in kind of that January, February timeframe. But at the major command and core function lead level that we talked about a minute ago, some of that action is happening in that fall prior. And so at your level, you may see calls for data to support POM build well before the air staff is working that, because the air staff in the fall time frame is working the budget defense. And so it's just a cycle, a kind of a circular calendar of when some of those inputs happen. And at your level, at the installation and at the major command level, your call for inputs is probably happening several months before this. So the HAF is going to issue some guidance, and that's what you're seeing here. The HAF is going to issue some guidance. There's going to be a MILCON working group that from the CE, the civil engineer functional side we care about. That is all going to come together in kind of the late winter, early spring time frame in March and April, and you see an Air Force group event. You see some events as they progress through the timeline, eventually leading to some 4-star events in the Corona in the June time frame. And so what's happening in all of those areas in that entire intervening time is that inputs are coming in, they're being evaluated, they're being cross-checked for validity, they're being racked and stacked, they're comparing that against the TOA that we have available. In each of these levels of review, all of that is happening. And eventually it culminates with a chief and a secretary 4-star decision. And we'll talk a little bit more about the process as we get into 16, so that you understand kind of what the subsidiary pieces of that are as we look into each cycle. But the end state is that big block there on the bottom right. So on the 2nd of August, by the end of that, that kind of summer time frame, the budget is due to OSD. So the Air Force is going to hit send on its database on the 2nd of August and submit that data into OSD. So moving on, let's talk about 15. So 15, as we all remember, and we're all about to experience, came after the sequestration year of 13, and a lot of the risks that happened in the FY14 timeframe. So it was a significant event relative to budget. And what you see in this statement are the kinds of things that drove the Air Force's budget build. And I like this slide because it articulates, kind of where we're headed. What we're talking about is, look at the Secretary Hagel's comments, right? In this constrained budget environment. So up front, that it would indicate to us that we're going to be making some tough choices. And if I had to articulate the FY15 budget, I would tell you it's all about tough choices because the Air Force had to do some pretty significant things. And we'll again get into some programmatic detail for that from your perspective of what does that mean at the base civil engineer squadron? What does that mean to me? The goal here, the Secretary James' comment, tomorrow's Air Force has to be the most agile, credible, and affordable total force team capable of meeting what our combatant commander needs. So there are important things to draw from that. Affordable, combatant commander. So our driving functions are those things that we have to do to meet our mission needs, but we don't have all the money that we need to meet all those requirements. So we have to be concerned about an affordability perspective. And the question that we're going to see that in the Chief's comment, and I'm going to move on to slide 6 here and talk about it, is what is the guiding principles that talked about how we're going to make that balance. So the Chief's comments basically say, I want the Air Force to be in a certain place in 2023. So you see on the left-hand part of that slide, Air Force 2023. What are the things that we need to have in our Air Force 10 years from now to be able to do the things that the combatant commanders want us to do in an affordable way? And I think we would all be very familiar with all of these things. These are not new. Respond in hours, not days. Fly, fight, and win. The win against any adversary. Innovative airmen. Those are all things that the Air Force are hallmarks for your Air Force. I would translate those to the other side of the chart and say, okay, if that's the signpost that I'm marching towards, what are some of the guides that get me there? How do I cross-check myself as I move from point A to point B? And so what does this mean? What does that mean when we say we're going to respond in hours, not days? It means that we have to remain ready for the full spectrum of military operations. And if we're going to do all of that and be affordable, then you get to the second guiding principle, which is we have to be able to make vertical cuts, not horizontal cuts. If we're gonna have to make reductions, peanut butter spread cuts to force structure, for example, don't save us big money. They do save money, but if I have to maintain the infrastructure to keep the A-10 working, then it doesn't matter. It does to a certain degree. But if I have to maintain that infrastructure for 20 airplanes, maintaining it for 40 airplanes really isn't that much more expensive in an order of magnitude discussion. Where I save the big money is when I decide to not only get rid of the 20 airplanes, but to get rid of the 40 airplanes and get rid of that entire support infrastructure that goes along with them. And those are the kinds of tough decisions that your Air Force had to make to meet the budget targets relative to FY15. How do we handle that change in force structure? Goes to the next bullet. We look to the total force to maximize what we can do and what we can provide. And if I have to pick things, what are the things I should pick? So from the Chief and Secretary's perspective, one of the things that we should consider is that we should focus on those unique capabilities that the Air Force provides to the joint team, particularly against that high-end potential adversary. So as we considered our rack and stack of 1 to N and all of those things I mentioned to you on that slide that all flow up through all those panels, how do I tell this requirement against that requirement? And so these are the guiding principles that allow that corporate process to begin to make sense of what is it that we have, what is it that we need to have, where are the disconnects in that, and what am I going to be forced to take risk in to get there? So I'm going to move on to slide 7 because this really illustrates the point. And what we wind up seeing is that to make the budget levels work, you wind up balancing these 3 things, and I love this picture, right? You're balancing capability, capacity, and readiness. And so the first thing, obviously, we're going to seek efficiencies and cut overhead, right? So we all agreed that we're going to do the smart things relative to business sense. OSD told the Air Force, told all the services that they should take risk in their installations portfolios because they wanted to save warfighting and necessary capabilities and capacity. And so as you see, and we'll talk about it in more detail in a little bit, we took risk in our FY15 program, particularly from where it was in FY14. So some of you just finished your FY14 execution year, and I hope it was a really good one for you because the amount of money that's allocated in FY15 is substantially less than what was allocated in FY14. And we'll see that discussion carry forward. And so you are going to be living in a riskier environment. From a resources perspective, at the installation level, and particularly in the base civil engineer squadron, you should expect to have less money in 15 than you had in 14. So with that said, let's look at the rest of that, because you can't meet the budget targets with just that discussion alone. You have to go to other avenues to make those balances. And so you get to this capacity, capability, and readiness issue. So what did the Air Force do? The Air Force looked to divest fleets. So I know that you all have all been seeing the news over the last, since the budget rolled out early this spring, about the A-10 discussion, where the Air Force chose to divest the A-10 in its entirety, where we took, specific reductions in small aircraft to meet targets. That whenever we were making choices, we would choose to fund new capability over upgrading the old. And so you will see things like the Air Force chose to maintain a certain level of funding, say for the F-35 program, versus reinvigorate the A-10. So that you're making that choice that I have the platform that I need to have to go back to the guiding principles when in 2023, when I'm seeking to meet that end state, that milepost that we talked about in 2023. The last bullet there, keep no more force structure than we can afford to keep ready. I would reverse that and say what we're saying is the force structure that we maintain, we're going to keep it ready. The Chief and the Secretary are pretty well committed to the fact that we're going to keep flying hours and the WSS program relatively fully funded so that our airframes and our air crews maintain the highest level of readiness that we can sustain. Again, going back to those 2023 guideposts that we talked about on the previous slides. So the bottom line here from General Welsh, from the Chief, is we're going to build the most capable Air Force against a high-end threat that's affordable in 2023. To do that, we'll balance capability, capacity, and readiness. I think that's a great way to summarize what happened in PB15. Now let's go into some details. So if you look at the Air Force budget, what this slide attempts to give you is how do we spend that money? And what I'll try to tell you as we get further into this is where's the civil engineer money inside this big bucket? So if you look at the Air Force total bill, if I went to the budget and went to the congressional website, www.budget.gov or whatever it is, and hit print, I would see the Air Force gets $138 billion, billion with a B, annually for FY15. You take out the non-blue part of it. That's the pass-through money like medical and those kinds of things that are in our budget, but we don't really control. So you take those off the top. You take out the military personnel costs off the top. You see MilCon there in the total. RDT&E, procurement, and O&M. And so what these two charts are giving you is 14 enacted versus the 15 PB request. And so O&M, $44.3 billion. Translate that across, and you see how a good portion of that in the middle pie does with day-to-day ops. And we talked about the RDT&E and the procurement side. So go back to what the Chief just said. The Chief just said that we're going to balance our capabilities, capacity, and readiness, our capabilities, capacity, and readiness against each other to do this. So where do I get that capability and capacity? In some cases, I get capability from that RDT&E and procurement. That's where I'm buying that capability that I need in the 2023 timeframe. And so you see how these programs are broken out in a significant way. So you bring all that up to the upside, to the top side there, and you see installation support in that small wedge. And we're going to go into more detail about what comprises that installation support account, because I think that's where you're most interested. So I'm going to move on to slide 9. And what we're talking about in slide 9 is the difference between a PB, a unsequestered Air Force, and a Budget Control Act or sequestered Air Force. And what these little lines indicate for you is billions of dollars of difference. So what we're saying is that between the top line there gives you the FY12 Air Force President's budget, and then you see the 13 and 14 lines. And then at the bottom, you're seeing that budget, the BBA, right? If you all remember the Bipartisan Budget Agreement, and then the BCA, the Budget Control Act. So when the BBA, the Bipartisan Budget Agreement, was enacted, it allowed some relief to what the otherwise budget would have been in FY15, and that's that higher level. If you carry that back and say, I'm going to be sequestered or not going to be sequestered depends on which of those two lines that you track to next. So in FY15, what we Air Force attempted to show to Congress was there are things that your Air Force can do at the President's budget unsequestered level that we cannot do at the sequestered level. And what you see here is the ramifications of that delta on that line. If I have to take out those billions of dollars, that middle section there, what do I give up? And that's what this chart indicates for you. So I'd encourage you to spend a second taking a look at those things that articulate what we can and can't do. Then you look in FY15 and say, okay, this is a pretty complicated chart. And a moment ago, I mentioned to you about orange and red when we started this. This slide attempts to give you what orange and red are, and it carries forward that same discussion we were just having about the delta in top line. So what you're looking at here is the orange money versus the red money. The orange money is if I am sequestered, this is the TOA, the dollars available that I expect to have in the United States Air Force in those indicated years 15 to 19. The bipartisan budget agreement gave us that green wedge. So instead of being on the orange line, we got some additional relief in FY15 relative to what the budget was going to be. Going forward in 16 through 19, we have to make a choice. And the choice that the Air Force has made is what kind of content, what kind of capability do we put at the Budget Control Act in that orange money section? And then on top of that, if I had more money, if we, the Air Force, or we OSD had additional dollars, where would we spend them? How would we do that? And what this attempts to do is to provide the cogent discussion points as to what you're giving up in your United States Air Force when you go to a sequestered level, right? So in that red money are things like a significant amount of installations money, but there are also weapon systems and force structure. And the message that we're trying to be able to allow the Chief and the Secretary to convey to OSD and eventually to Congress is at the sequestered level, there are things that your Air Force simply can't afford to do. And this is the delta that we have. This is how we would articulate it. And that's what that red money, that number 3 area is of the chart. The number 4 area, just so I don't leave you hanging on that, that was a request from OSD, from the Office of Secretary of Defense Comptroller's Office, to say, if you had additional funding in FY15 as part of this budget request, if Congress decided to add additional money to the Department of Defense, what would you, the Air Force, do with it? And so we were asked to provide some content relative to the things that we could do. Again, there is some installations, MILCON, and some things like that that are inside that funding. Okay, so now I'm going to move. With that in mind, this slide gives you quickly what's inside that. So the answer that we told Congress or we told OSD was, if I had that additional money in FY15, here are some of the things I could do with it. At the end of the day, I could put a pretty significant amount of money in restoration and modernization, MILCON, and facility sustainment. So again, all of those kinds of money that we're used to seeing on the installation side. So what does this all roll up to? So at the macro level, this is a pretty complicated chart. What it tells you in the top left is that from the 15 requests, the 15 PB position, the budget request that went across, we continued to fund utilities at 95% green. We funded that requirement. We didn't take any money out of it. We maintained the support for the European infrastructure consolidation. That's what that second one is. And then we maintained our environmental accounts to ensure we were compliant. So where did we take risk in the 15 budget? And what you see in the top right, I'll go through each one of those, but those are reflected in that red, yellow, green below. And what we're attempting to show is where we have taken risk and what we have done. And those are FIDEP kind of numbers. So when you're looking at the sustainment row there, 15 PBR, you see 65% and 80%. So in the 15 PB, we reduced the amount of funding from the facility sustainment model perspective to 65% of the model. Across the FIDEP, it's 80%. We rise to 80%. You see that kind of carried throughout. So again, facility sustainment, we'll touch on it in a minute, but you see that as you all know, the requirement is 80% of the models what the Air Force hopes to fund to. And so we would say, hey, we took a lot of money out of that. That's a red kind of item. And so that's what that chart attempts to indicate for you in each of our major program areas. And you'll see those places that we've attempted to minimize risk are those places that we view as must-pay bills, particularly at the installation level, right? So your utilities bill, we know you're going to pay your utilities bill. You have no recourse but to do that. So we funded that to 95% of the requirement in 15 and then across the FIDEP. Sustainment, in accordance with the OSD guidance and in the larger picture of what the Air Force had to do, we took risk in facility sustainment along with other installations accounts. And that's what those lines above that attempt to indicate for you. So you see we reduced sustainment, we reduced restoration and modernization, we reduced MILCON, we deferred overseas MFH MILCON to outside the FIDEP. We are not pursuing additional new initiatives, but we are continuing those initiatives that are already in the pipe for utilities privatization. We reduced some service contracts below AFCOLS 4. We just didn't have the money to bring them up to AFCOLS 4. We did reduce fire truck procurement as part of the 15 PB. So some relatively significant events that will manifest themselves at your installation with physical outcomes. You will see less money in 15 than you saw in 14. In FY14, as an example, the restoration and modernization account was close to $800 million total force across the Air Force. In FY15, that same account is $547 million across the Air Force total force. So, a very significant reduction in the dollars that are available for your installations to do their missions. We recognize that there is risk associated with that, and we have articulated that risk to the best of our ability to the corporate structure and in that decision process. So I'm going to move on to slide 13 and talk to you about what does that mean. So as we talk about that risk, it's important for you to understand that we don't take that risk lightly. We understand that when you underfund installations, that we are forcing our major commands and eventually the Air Force Installation and Mission Support Center, but you, the base civil engineer community, to take risk and make decisions about what you have the ability to do. So what we know that maintenance is cheaper than repair, right? So the example we use is the oil change, right? If I have my car and I keep the oil change in it, I'm less likely to have to repair it. But if I don't change the oil, I know eventually I'm going to have to buy a new engine. And if I don't buy the new engine, or I don't buy a good new engine, eventually I'm going to have to replace the car. And so what these indicate for you is that we know that maintenance is cheaper than repair. We know that when you fail to do maintenance, not only is that repair more expensive, it's also more likely. And that when we look at our funding levels, there is actually a break point where we say there is a point where we idle the workforce. Whenever we start talking about facility sustainment and in general about our other accounts, there is a point where once I pay for the civ and the mill pay and the must pay contracts, I don't have money left to do other things. And so we attempt to articulate that. How do we think it's going to manifest? Now, you all, I would be interested in your thoughts on this, but what we think is going to manifest as is at the installation level, you are going to be forced to prioritize because you're not going to have enough money to do the things you need to do. We believe that you are going to prioritize mission facilities and mission requirements above non-mission requirements. And so what we're attempting to say in the bottom of that slide is that these are all notional numbers. So if you've been writing them down, please erase them. It's just we're attempting to make an argument here that tries to characterize what we're doing. To say that if at base X, I have a third of my facilities are what I would call mission critical or direct mission support, then I'm probably going to wind up spending a significant amount of my money that I get on those requirements. It could be half of the money I get. So what does that mean? It means that the requirements that I have in those other mission areas, mission support or just community support, probably don't get the level of funding they need to maintain the level of service and the standards that we would like them to maintain. There's a real world impact at your installation from decisions to do this. We understand that. And I would be very much interested in having your help articulate the impacts of this. So that's kind of the discussion that we're having as we look at each of these areas. So I'm going to move on to FY16, and I want you to draw the distinction between what we've done and what we've articulated previously in the FY15 timeframe. So going back to our agenda, we're going to talk about how do we get to 16, what are kind of the rules of engagement to how we built 16, and kind of get into the process and timeline. And this is where I hope we'll be able to talk about how the POM is built. So what we talk about here is that in the FY16 build, we started with the same 2023 priorities that we talked about for FY15. We looked at the implementation plans that allowed us to kind of prioritize what was happening and how it was going to work. And we held a series of planning choices events this spring. And what those planning events did is they allowed the 3 stars and the 4 stars to make large capability decisions. And in this environment, an unclassified environment, what I can tell you is we're making decisions over, do I want specific high-end capabilities? Maybe even I want niche capabilities, some very special things, or do I want broad capacity with maybe less capability? And so you start to build these planning choices that would enable the 4 stars and the chief and the secretary to have very senior discussions about what is it that they want the Air Force to be able to do. And that's why it's important to follow this through on that bar chart, because it allows you to say the guiding principles again are, what do I want the Air Force to be in 2023? And do I want it to have this capability or this capacity? Am I willing to trade this capacity to get that capability? And they all feed in together. And then you get to these program trades events, which happened in June, and those begin to direct how the POM's final debates and closure goes. As you look forward to next year, and we'll touch on this again in a minute, how do we think that changes? Well, you may have seen that the Air Force recently published its 30-year strategy. And there is a lot of work happening right now on a subsidiary strategic master plan and some secondary annexes that support that, like a human capital annex and a posture annex and a capabilities annex. All of those things will enable a series of planning choices events this fall to influence how we do POM 17. And so again, I'll touch on that when we get to that 17 planning discussion. But what I want you to see is we're kind of slowly stepping from that big snake chart that you saw way up front, where we kind of cycled through all of these things and have a very programmatic discussion, to where we're stepping to a capabilities discussion, where we talk about what do we want our Air Force to be from a capabilities perspective. And then we allow that to say, if I want this capability, then I have to have Program A, Program B, Program C. And we do it that way as opposed to the reverse. So moving on to slide 16, process. So this is a pretty simple chart to try to articulate a very complex thing. And I will attempt to do some justice to this, and I know you will have questions. So I guess this is the benefit of me doing this taped device at DCO, because I just get to say that I hope your questions get answered. What I will start with is say that there is a baseline that happens in POM. So when you start building a POM, a budget, you start from where you ended last year. So what you look at is, where did my budget end in PB15? What did PB15 look like? And that's my left bookend. And then we go into these phases. Phase 1 is all about, do I want to make significant or insignificant changes, either one, inside a portfolio to rebalance that portfolio, to kind of set the ship straight, right? Do I want that ship, do I want it to be a little bit geared this way or a little bit geared that way? But I'm not at this point deciding I want this one over that one. At this point, I'm saying, for the installations portfolio, for the Agile Combat Support portfolio, what are some of the internal things I needed to do? In this case, we built this portfolio in a cohesive way. So unlike POM 15, in 16, there was an entity called Enterprise-Wide Installations. And I'll sum it all up to say for you, it's basically all the things that we would do in the installation support panel, plus some other business. So if you're connecting dots, it's very similar to what we might think would be part of the Installation and Mission Support Center, AFIMSC, at its conclusion. And from a budgetary perspective, for the budgeteers, we're talking about things like that are in SAG-R and SAG-Z, right? What are the things that are in your FSRM, your base operations and support? What are those types of entities? And how do they look holistically? And are they balanced correctly? So does my enterprise-wide installations portfolio have the right mix of facility sustainment, restoration and modernization, military construction, facility operations and utilities? Are all of those pieces of that structure balanced amongst themselves in the way that we would want? And are there things about them that we need to change internally from within the bucket that we have? And so really what I'm saying to you is, if I've got $100, do I want to evenly spread $10 between the 10 functions that I'm supporting there? Or does one of them really need 15 and it's okay for the other one to have 5? And have that discussion internally. And then we move forward and say, okay, if that's my platform, that's where I'm headed, what are the pieces of that are broken? Where are there disconnects? And so here you might see things like we have a utilities disconnect. Whenever we got out of balance, that phase 1 part, we looked at our utilities estimates and we said, you know what? Our utilities account is about $500 million short across the FIDEP of what we think it needs to be, based on what the inflationary factors are for utilities. And so those go forward in that little yellow arrow there of Air Force Board disconnects. So what we've done is we've said, okay, whole world, and certainly your installations hopefully had the opportunity to do this. You tell me what's broken at your installation. You tell me what's broken at your MAGCOM. So one of the examples, certainly from a PACAF perspective, is there's a shortfall at JBEAR relative to security force manning. And so that one base issue got rolled up into this overall look. But some of the other ones were things like the base level comm is underfunded, right? So my communications O&M at the base level is underfunded. There we have the opportunity to look at this from an enterprise-wide perspective, thus the name enterprise-wide installations, and say, hey, is that an issue only for PACAF or for Air Education and Training Command, or is that an issue across the whole force? And if it is, what's its magnitude? And so it allows you to kind of bring all those together and say, okay, I have these issues. On top of that, we talked a minute ago about those program trades events. So I have what we've gotten right now is I've balanced my books. I've got a program that at least initially I understand what it does. I understand the disconnects that I have. I understand the things that I'm not doing. I understand what initiatives I might have, things that I would like to do that I don't have the money to do. And then we kind of roll all those together and they go into program trades. And so what you're seeing there is from phase 1, we have a balanced submission. I have a listing of all of that stuff, all the disconnects, initiatives, and the submissions, and they go forward into program trades. And at the 4-star level, then with the 4 stars can say, I want to balance this requirement against that requirement. I want to take some risk in installations so that I can fully fund the combat rescue helicopter or whatever. So what you're seeing here is that program trades allows you then to come out and say, back to our orange and red discussion, this is the content of the Air Force in orange money, and this is the content of the Air Force at the red money or the unsequestered level. And what you begin to see is a Air Force capabilities matrix that says, if I'm sequestered, this is what my Air Force can do, and this is what capabilities I have. If I'm unsequestered, I can add these things on top of it. And so that's what you get to POM. And so you come back to the far right and say, I've got a 4-star checkpoint there, and my 16 POM is now comprised of orange content and red content. So not to leave this slide with a couple of things unbalanced. If there were things in our submission up front, phase 1, where we decided that $10, $15, $5 discussion, if we did that and it got reviewed and approved as part of phase 1, we don't have to have that discussion again. It just automatically moves forward into the final. So that's what that balanced submission part says. Is if the Agile Combat Support core function lead or if the Global Integrated ISR core function lead balanced inside their portfolio and during the phase 1 process, everybody nodded their head and said, that's good. We don't have to re-adjudicate that again. So that's balanced submission. And then the next part is, how do we start to meet our bills? So if I believe there are a couple of $1 billion worth of bills that may or may not happen, how would I begin to talk about that? And so as you do your POM submission, you also want to begin to have a discussion about if I have to change for whatever reason, how do I go about that? And that's what the offset discussion is. So in simple terms, what you're seeing here is a balance your portfolio, phase 1, a trade amongst portfolios, phase 2, some validation, and then content. And that's what the POM process looks like. And we'll move on to 17, and you'll see there's some changes in how we would do it. But before we get there, I'm going to move to slide 17 and talk to you about timing. I only touch on this slide just to show you that some of this happens in a relatively short time frame, right? So you see there is a lot of activity happening in the month of April. And then in the month of May, there's a lot of prep work that's happening for the month of June. There's a lot of action that's happening in the month of June. And again, your installation and your major command inputs to that may be happening prior to this, but they're probably, at least at the major command level, significant players in this at the same time. So from a timing perspective, this is kind of that timeline that replaces that snake chart that we saw in the 15 discussion, where we had this long kind of snaky process. In this case, it's a relatively streamlined process with a couple of key events, but there's a lot of prep work that happens in those key events to make them all go smoothly. And so that's what this timeline really attempts to articulate for you, with, again, the baseline being that we're going to submit our POM to OSD in September. So when I look at 16, what does it look like? So right now, the 16 kind of amounts from the 15 position are about $10 billion-ish. So when we talk about what do our accounts look like, this is big picture what they look like. What does this money do? This money supports, all of our major installations and minor installations, active duty, guard, and reserve inside these accounts. So it is a total force picture of what the portfolio looks like. And what I would tell you is that from the 16 to 15 position, there was minor changes at the BCA level and the PB level. So depending on which of those levels you're looking at, the types of risk that you see happening in the 15 budget get mirrored in the 16 budget at the Budget Control Act level. It's a little bit better, but it's not a return to full funding that we saw in 14, for example. At the unsequestered level, it's very similar to what we might have seen in the kind of the 14 timeframe. So how do we build? When we're actually building, and I talked about that enterprise-wide installations portfolio, there was a view in 16 that let's talk about how we build this so that we POM as we execute. So we program as we execute. Let's figure out where we're spending the money and let's put it in there and move forward with a couple of caveats, right? We're not going to be able to undo things that we agreed to as part of the 15 PB. Not as big a deal from the installation support panel perspective, but from a budget perspective, what that really says is we're not going to buy back the A10 in the POM of 16 that we divested in PB 15. That's really what that says. We're making a couple of key assumptions, right? We assume that OCO still exists. That's a big deal for the installations portfolio. There's a lot of money that we fund from the OCO fund stream for our installations and operations that are ongoing in the Mideast and in Afghanistan. Those are not in the base. So every time we talk about these, that $10.2 billion that I mentioned to you, that is not reflective of the OCO contributions. And that would be a significant emotional event to try to get those into our baseline. Whenever we do some of these things, the key on this slide was, what are the roles of how we do this? And I'll draw you back to that discussion where we talked about in the very first slide of how we build POM. We build it from the core function leads. And the MAGCOMs have a role. And then in this case, we were talking about SAF-FM having a role to make sure that when we consider O&M, that if the example I would give you is second destination transportation or some of the other kind of must-pay accounts, are we really putting the money against that line that we know historically we spend? If I honestly spend $100 a year doing this and I only program it for 50, then I'm just setting myself up for a bill. And that's part of the discussion that we had on the utilities account. I know we're going to pay the utilities bill, so if it's underfunded by $500 million across the FIDEP, we, the Air Force, have to fix that problem. That's what we're really saying here. ISP, so as the Installation Support Panel Chair, we were the focal point for integrating all of those enterprise-wide activities. What did that mean? It meant that in addition to the normal civil engineer stuff, we're also talking about the base level logistics and the base level installation kind of force support squadron stuff and the base level comm. And so we were the integrator for all of these other people that play at the installation level. ISP has always had a role in things like the base level PA and base level contracting. That's always been in our role. But in this case, we broaden that perspective to say, what are the other pieces of your Air Force that support installation level funding and how do we go about supporting them? That's what this was all about. And we kind of already talked about the phase 1, phase 2 pieces of what did we do in phase 1, phase 2. So moving on, slide 20. So how did we actually physically do this? And this is where I want to, I don't want you to walk away from this thinking that inputs go into this giant box and somebody shakes the box and out comes goodness. It's a lot of work. And so what you wind up having to do is who is the decision authority, right? That's the number one first question. Who's making the decisions? And in this case, for phase one, so again, that balancing internally, making those trades, it was the Air Force A47, now the Air Force A4, Lieutenant General Fetter. So we incorporated all that, took it to General Fetter, got her approval, and submitted it on behalf of the enterprise-wide installations accounts on behalf of the Air Force to the process. When we get to phase two, we roll all of that up into the Agile Combat Support Core Function Lead, the ACS SIFL. They are the source when we get to phase two. It was important that we have this discussion that there's this thought of, okay, well, when you're talking about enterprise-wide, you mean this part. No, when I say enterprise-wide, when I am looking at this from an enterprise-wide perspective, I'm looking at it from a complete total force Air Force perspective, and I want to be able to provide advice and facts to the senior leaders. It's not Pat Baker's job to decide that this is more important than that. It's Pat Baker's job to provide decision makers the facts associated with this choice versus that choice in an unemotional, consistent, repeatable way. That's what the point of the EW installations portfolio was. How did it physically work? Well, if you're at the installation level, you probably talked your utilities account with your utilities MAGCOM representative. And then that MAGCOM representative contacted our integrated planning team, or integrated process team lead for facility operations, Ms. Justice. And she integrated all of those MAGCOM inputs for us and delivered that balanced submission. In this case, that submission that said, I'm short $500 million. That's where all those things happen. At the installation level, I'll go back to our JBER example, where we had identified that there was a mistake made in POM 14 that uncovered some required security forces manning, and it was purely a mistake. We needed to fix it. That rolls up from the installation to the major command, from the major command to the enterprise-wide installation source, and got integrated. So what did that mean? We had over 120 different inputs of things that were unfunded that I should do, or things that were underfunded, things that were broken, and that we had to validate and integrate into a one-to-N list. And we did that. And that entire list went forward into the process that we talked about there on that orange and red slide, that phase one process where we said, these are the things I can fix internally, right? Like I have a lease disconnect for housing for some OSD support staff in Central America. You know what, that's a must-pay bill. We need to fix that. So we fixed that internally. There are some other things that we could not get to that we needed the Air Force's help to fix. All of those got prioritized and integrated into that one-to-N list and submitted as part of the proposal. I will tell you that from the big Air Force perspective, there were over $18 billion of those disconnects turned in. So I'll draw your attention back to that discussion that we had about that 138, right? So that 138 minus the pass-through dollars, that 138 minus the pay, and get you back down to those O&M and investment accounts, and say that $18 billion means there's a lot of broken glass that exists in our Air Force as a result of the 15 budget. And there was a lot of consternation about how do we articulate that in a meaningful way so that our decision makers can understand the impacts of doing something or not doing something. And that was the whole point of that timeline between the January to June timeframe that we did for POM 16. So, gets you back to slide 21, and we say, you saw this before, right? So this is that same orange and red. How did that orange and red discussion happen? And I just put this slide up here briefly to say that we are continuing that same discussion, that there is content that happens at the orange level and there is content that happens at the red level. There is an Air Force we can afford at the sequestered level, and there is an Air Force we can afford at an unsequestered level. There are installation things that we can do at the BCA sequestered level, and there are more things we can do at the unsequestered level. That's what I want you to take away from this slide, is that there is a clear delineation of the capacity and the capabilities that are associated inside the installations portfolio for sure, but the broader portfolio, yes, relative to your Air Force requirements. So, slide 22. So we're closing in on the fun part. So now that we've done our POM, and we understand what our Air Force looks like at the orange and red, that sequestered and unsequestered level, what do we do about it? So we hit send in September, and it goes to the Office of Secretary of Defense, and now we're getting graded, right? So the OSD told the services, I want you to do X, Y, and Z. And now they're checking, did we do X, Y, and Z? And so you see there's this process that happens, and it's called Program Budget Review, PBR. And what happens is that OSD or the combatant commanders can take issue with our budget. And what they do is they actually write an issue paper, and they submit all those in, and they get adjudicated, and a list of approved issues comes out. And those issues go through a vetting process that's ongoing right now in this fall time frame. And eventually we get to a point where in December, the DepSecDef, the Secretary of Defense, the senior leaders in the Department of Defense have made some decisions about those issues, that they've decided that we are going to accept this content or not accept this content. Air Force, I want you to buy more of that and less of this, whatever they decide. All of those things begin to happen in the December timeframe. And so hopefully we get to budget closure in the mid-December timeframe so that when we get around to January, the Air Force is ready to hit, the Department of Defense is ready to hit send to the Office of Management and Budget so that the President's budget can get delivered to Congress on the 2nd of February as is required. So this whole process drives that discussion. Now, I put this slide in here because I also want you to understand when we are doing this 16 defense, you are probably providing inputs to your major command about 17. Your major command is probably asking you a lot of questions right now about what are your requirements and what are your shortfalls as part of their 17 budget. So that's why there's this lag that's happening between the timing of what you're doing and what your major command is doing and between what the air staff is doing. Now we'll draw your attention to the lower part of that slide and say there are some planning events happening. So what you saw for POM 16 was that we were doing those program trades and planning choices kind of in the spring. Well, that's right in the middle of when we were building the POM. That was a little late to need. And so what your Air Force is doing is it's saying, let's start thinking about our 17 big picture, that capability, capacity, readiness discussion that we've been having for the last 45 minutes or so. Let's start having some of that strategic level discussion in the fall. And let's decide so that we can give some guidance to our programmers what I want to have happen from a strategic picture, from a planning perspective. And so some of those events are happening simultaneously. So this is a pretty busy time. But the end state that we hope to see is that, again, budget closes and gets ready, and we get all this, everything's done but the crying by the time we get to the middle of December. And so we're all ready to submit the budget. And that leads us back to 17. So that new process. So you remember the big snake chart that we had before. And what we're seeing now is a different view of this, and a view that says, if I have a strategy and I can articulate that strategy from a 30-year perspective, maybe I can then develop a plan from a 20-year perspective that says, I want to be able to do this 30 years from now. This is what I think my Air Force does. And what you'll see in the Air Force strategy is a reliance on agility, as an example, among other things. So if I take that characteristic that the Air Force of 30 years from now needs to be, it needs to be agile. What does that translate to in key capability areas? And that's what that strategic master plan attempts to do, 4-star level document. And it attempts to identify for us what our strategic priorities are and how we ought to start doing our planning. And it allows then those core function leads, right? Go back to the very beginning of our discussion. Who does this budget stuff? Core function leads, along with other MAGCOM support. So if I went back to that and said, how does the strategic agility discussion, what does it mean to agile combat support? What does it mean to installations? Then I begin to see that maybe that mirrors into a core function support plan. And then I become to understand what choices I have to make, or I have to get the senior leaders of the Air Force to make relative to those points. And that's the process we're talking about, where we're going to let strategy help us articulate a plan, and that the tenets in that plan drive us to choices. And then those choices become programs, not the other way around. So I think this is a great thing to do because it allows us to track back from our strategic leadership, from our senior leaders. What is it that we want our various capabilities, whether they be installations or F-35s or communications or cyber, what do we want them to do? And rather than have that discussion at a programmatic level, like I want this base to be able to sustain these number of planes, let's have a big picture discussion about what do we want our installations to be able to do to support our Air Force requirements? What are the installation demands to meet that? If the goal is strategic agility, what does that mean from an installation perspective? And that's what this gets to. So you get to these places where you have this discussion, you get to those planning choices that we saw on the previous slide, and I get eventually to what's called the Program Guidance Memorandum. And so now I'm going to be able to give specific guidance, I being the Strategic Air Force in this case, to our programmers and say, we big Air Force have decided that we need more cyber, and we're willing to take less of this other thing to get it. That allows you then to start having some very specific discussions and understanding what your priorities are. And that's what the rest of the process does. So you get into this, you have the program trades, that same kind of, again, strategic choices. We get in and we do that phase 1, phase 2 kind of stuff. And at the end of the day, we come out with a POM process. So in my mind, a fundamentally different view from that first slide we looked at about what did 15 look like. A fundamentally different way to approach the problem of getting to a budget. How does it physically work? So this timeline I pulled from the Agile Combat Support Core Function Lead, and it basically says, okay, if I've got this requirement to be agile, what does that mean to me? The way that I articulate that is in a core function support plan. So I kind of start at the bottom of this chart, that FY17 core function support plan. And if that's due in October, what do I need to do to get there? What are the things I have to consider? And that's what this timeline gets to, is we probably need to figure out what are the key capabilities inside Agile Combat Support. So inside Agile Combat Support, there are 5 key areas: base, protect, support, sustain, and field. So base and protect sound a lot like things that we engineers would be interested in. So that's things like your fire departments, your chem bio, your readiness stuff, as well as your normal main base stuff, base and protect. So what are the key things inside base and protect that we need to be able to do as your United States Air Force? Well, I need to be able to establish, operate, sustain, and eventually close, among other things. So I can start to neck down the capability of Agile Combat Support to base, to what does that mean? And now I can begin to articulate, okay, if I have a requirement, I have a need to be able to establish bases. Now let's talk about it from an expeditionary sense. Then do I have any gaps? Do I have any shortfalls in my ability to do that? Do I have the right organizing, trained, equipped manpower? Do I have the right doctrine? Do I have the right material? Do I have all of those pieces that go along with that? And if I don't, then I have a gap. If I have some of them, they're just not funded to the appropriate levels, then I have a shortfall. But what this allows us to do is say, take my gaps and my shortfalls and prioritize them and say, what is it that the Air Force prioritized? What is it that the Agile Combat Support Team needs to do to meet the Air Force mission set as articulated in that strategy? And I can begin to say, you know what, that shortfall is more important than this gap, right? I can begin to articulate the impacts of those. And so you begin to be able to have this discussion inside the Agile Combat Support Core Function Lead. And then you can roll that up and have that same kind of discussion amongst all the capabilities and say, Chief, if you want me to be strategically agile, then I'm going to have to be able to establish air bases at remote locations in this kind of time frame. Right now, I can't do that. I don't have enough people. I don't have the right expeditionary engineering tools. I don't have the right doctrine, whatever it is. And you can begin to understand how all of this feeds together. So from your perspective at the installation, to bring it home to you, if I have to operate and sustain those installations, what does that mean financially? It means there is a level of funding that I have to maintain to allow you to maintain your installations. There is a level of funding that is necessary for you to, to modernize and recapitalize your installations so that they are capable of sustaining the platforms that the Air Force needs it to sustain. And so you see all of this begin to marry through in the discussions. What winds up happening then is all that gets rolled up into these planning events that were on the bottom of that chart, and then we can have a holistic discussion that allows the chief and the secretary and the 4 stars to make some informed decisions about this capability versus that capability. Okay, only a couple more. So we're moving into slide 26. So how do you physically do that? So I identify what the requirements are from a baseline. So if I said, I have an FY15 baseline, to decide what I need, I'm going to develop some bookends to help me expose the seams. So I'm going to develop what are called planning force proposals, PFPs. And the way that we do this in the corporate structure is that we say, I'm going to take the 15 position and I'm going to extend it out forever. And then I'm going to say, okay, what do I have to cut to get to zero real growth? What that really means is if I had to cut 10% of your budget, you'll go down. What would you cut to get there? And what is the risk associated with that? So if I have to cut 10% of facility sustainment, I can figure out, that's a math problem. I can figure out what that is. And then we assign the risk rating to that. What does that mean? Does that mean that the risk to installations to be able to operate and sustain those installations is high? Is it significant? Is it critical? Is it moderate? Whatever it is. And I'm allowed then, I can start at this baseline and I can work backwards to say, if I try to get 10%, this is what the things I have to give up are, and this is what that means to me from a risk to mission and a risk to force perspective. And then I can say, okay, from that baseline, now, if I had an unlimited amount of money, and I wanted to go to a moderate risk force, I wanted to minimize the risk in my capability, what would I have to do? What would I have to buy? And that allows you to add back in those slices. And oh, by the way, maybe I can change some of those slices along the way. And so I'm allowed to add back, and I can see that if I got to this, if I had this level of funding and I was able to provide a moderate risk force, what does that look like? What does it cost? And what capabilities does it bring to the table? And what is the risk associated with it? And now I begin to be able to really be able to articulate for the chief and the secretary and the 4-stars in the same discussion we're having, what are the bookends of my capability? Chief, secretary, if you leave me at the 15 baseline position, this is what I can do for you. If you ask me to give up more money, 10%, and you drive me to this position, this is what I can do for you, and here's the risk associated to the mission. If you gave me more money, this is what I could do, and this is the risk associated with your mission. So now you could begin to see, if I'm not happy with where, say, our cyber capabilities are today, and I wanted to increase that, what would I have to do? And now that I know what that bookend on this side is, I have a pretty good feel for that. So it allows you to have a very meaningful discussion, a content-enabled discussion about what capabilities are available in your Air Force and how you would balance them. And so it is a powerful way to see if the capabilities that we're trading amongst get us to that strategic picture for 30 years from tomorrow. Okay? All right. How do we talk about this from an installations perspective? And one of my kind of foot stomper things to kind of roll this all up is that we talk a lot about it from a Coles perspective. We talk about that what are the risks to our mission are embodied in Coles, right? So we can articulate that if I want to have a certain level of service, I know what that looks like from an AF Coles perspective, and I want to be able to price it out. So as I make that left and right decision that we talked about a moment ago, one of the key ways that we define that is Coles. So this is where you can help me at the installation level. You can make sure that whenever you're doing your Coles reports and they roll up, that they clearly articulate what risk you're taking, that your Coles measurements are as accurate as you can make them, because I can see the funding that you have. I know what money you have. And so what I can go back and look at then is I can say, gosh, I gave base X $100. And last year, I gave them $90. And their Coles level didn't change. So that means, if I'm happy with that Coles level, then I really only need to give them $90. I don't have to give them $100 because it doesn't change their Coles level. So it's becoming important for us to understand how Coles impact our budget, or maybe said the other way around, how our budget impacts our Coles. And so where we have the ability, where you at the installation have the ability to articulate that, please do so. Please do so. Because it's becoming the most powerful way that we have to articulate the risk to mission and the risk to force of our installations portfolio. So I would ask your help in talking about Coles. And I will draw you back to that through this chain that we've been on, that whenever you can help me articulate what the capabilities are associated with a certain funding level at a certain capability, then we can help articulate how that capability supports those larger Air Force requirements. And that allows us to make very definitive, informed decisions on the level of resourcing that we have available to us. So, with that said, that's the last slide. With that said, what I hope we've been able to talk with you about is how does a budget get built? It gets built through a very involved, interactive, collaborative process that your voice is heard in. You have a direct line into your major command and then eventually into your, obviously into the Installation and Mission Support Center, where your installation level disconnects or initiatives, your shortfalls and gaps, have the opportunity to roll up. We can look at them individually, just like we did at that JBEAR COP example that I gave you, or we can look at them holistically across the Air Force, like the Operation Support Funding for the COM that we talked about. There are ways that we can consider all this, and then that helps us articulate what the budget impact is. That collaborative process results at the end of the day in a budget submission that gets submitted to OSD, it gets graded, it gets adjusted, we eventually lock it, and then it gets submitted to Congress where we defend it and we respond to congressional language or congressional requirements. So that's POM. How do I think it's going to look in 17? I think it's going to look remarkably similar to how it looked in 16. I think the process is going to be very similar. I think that you will have the opportunity to provide input, again, on those levels. And certainly I would hope that you will help us articulate the AFCOLs and the impacts that these levels of funding have on you at the installation level. So I appreciate your time, and I hope this has been beneficial to you. Thank you.